Welcome to Echoes of the Past, where history isn't just old, it's oddly fascinating.
From forgotten facts to bizarre backstories, we dig into the dusty corners of time.
So you don't have to. I'm Jody, your amateur historian and full-time trivia hoarder.
And I'm Ephraim, here for the facts and the fun.
Let's rewind the clock and press play on the past. So, today we're going to be diving deep into a genre that's been scaring, thrilling, and fascinating audiences for centuries: horror. Whether you love a good ghost story, a monster movie, or a survival horror video game that makes you sleep with the lights on, this episode's for you. We'll be exploring where horror began in literature, how it evolved in film, and how it crept its way into video games. And we'll see how each version reflects what people feared most during different points in history. Now, here's the thing. Horror has been around for a very long time, and that was originally shocking to me, especially as someone who loves the workings of Edgar Allan Poe. So, let's start with horror's earliest film, literature. Way back before slasher films and creepy video games, horror lived on the page. And one of the first real horror stories, well, it's the Castle of Otranto, published all the way back in 1764. It's got haunted castles, family curses, and dramatic fainting spells. Classic Gothic drama. Then came Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was revolutionary not just for horror, but for science fiction too. A monster created by man out of science, and it's still relevant today when we talk about playing God or the consequences of unchecked progress. Did you know that horror started so far back on page?
I figure it would, because you only can do so much with like your normal fairy tale stories before someone's like, oh, what if we make this spooky?
That is really true. And I think my thing is like, we all know about Frankenstein. I feel like everybody knows that story. And a lot of people think that Mary Shelley was one of the very first like horror writers. And she's always been tagged as like the first. But when you really look at it, it was Horace Walpole, which was the Castle of Otranto. Now, my thing is, like, when I first got into horror, it wasn't Edgar Allan Poe, which is my favorite author. It was the story retellings of, like, the old nursery rhymes. So, the more realistic, I guess, horror stories of, like, Cinderella and Snow White and things like that. That's where I got started. Where did you get started?
Video games.
Really?
Yeah. Like, the first time I played Halo 2 and you encounter the flood for the first time scared me. And every time we play it, we get to that point, I'm like, okay, I'm not playing no more.
I feel that. You've been with me for over a year now. You see, I'm kind of a ninny when it comes to anything scary.
Yeah.
I think, what was it, 2 nights ago when I screamed so loud I thought I was going to have a sore throat for the next 2 days. Yeah, and that was playing Repo. So, when we're talking about, like I said, the Castle of Otranto being the first one, one of its most memorable lines is the actual opening line of the whole thing. And it's memorable because of its oddness. "What a sight for a father's eyes," cried Manfred distractedly, "to behold his child dashed to pieces." Now, widely considered the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto tells the story of Manfred, the tyrannical prince of Otranto, who is obsessed with securing his bloodline's rule. On the day his sickly son Conrad is set to marry the noble maiden Isabella, a giant helmet, yes, literally a massive helmet, mysteriously falls from the sky and crushes Conrad to death. Panicked by prophecy that this line will end, Manfred decides to divorce his wife and marry Isabella himself, despite her horrified resistance. Isabella escapes into a labyrinth beneath the castle with the help of a peasant named Theodore, who soon reveals his own mysterious ties to nobility, and supernatural events, as giant ghosts, moving portraits, and ancestral curses, escalate until the prophecy fulfills itself in a tragic fashion. Now, to me, that doesn't seem like it'd be very scary. That just seems like a very fantastical kind of feel to it. But thinking about the fact that this was back in like the 1700s, I feel like that makes it fit better into like the horror genre of back then.
Yeah.
Because like back then, you had everybody just dying of random things. And then of course you had nobility trying to continue their bloodlines no matter what it costs. So I guess for them back then that technically would have been like a horror story.
Yeah. And then like looking at it now, from a modern point, it probably looks really silly to us.
Yeah.
Considered how far we've gotten with the horror stuff and how like realistic we can get it to look.
Yeah.
And how gory and heart pounding we can get these horror movies to get.
That is true. After the 1700s book of the Castle of Otranto, you then go into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which again I've said, I feel like everybody kind of knows the story. It's really about just playing God and all of the things that come along with that. And of course, you know, getting shunned for your workings of mad scientist ideals. And that was written in 1818, which is the birth of the sci-fi horror. Then, of course, you've got Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1897, which came in with the classic vampire archetype. Which, fun fact, around that same time, in the late 1800s, people were actually having a, like, I would say a vampire conspiracy, where there were a lot of places around the world where they were actually afraid that people were going to come back as vampires from the grave.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I could see it. And then, of course, we've got Edgar Allan Poe coming in with the psychological dread, themes of madness. I'm pretty sure everybody's heard at least one of his stories. You know, everybody in middle school or high school has to read some of his tales.
Yeah, I did in middle school. We did the Telltale Heart.
Yeah.
That was a good one.
That was honestly the story that got me started into my obsession with Edgar Allan Poe. Was that specific story and how it played like a black and white cartoon in my head. And then I think I went to like the Black Cat and the Cask of Montillon. I can never say it right. But the Cask of that one. And those kind of like made me spiral. So Edgar Allan Poe, I believe, is a really good like ending point on the quote-unquote Gothic horrors that came in. Now, moving from the Gothic horror into the weird fiction and the cosmic horror, you move into H.P. Lovecraft, which is the terror of the unknown, the insignificant of humanity. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was alive from 1890 until 1937 and was a reclusive American writer whose horror stories often explored madness, forbidden knowledge, alien gods, and the fragility of human perception. While he wasn't widely recognized in his lifetime, his influence is now massive, seen in everything from Alien to Bloodborne. And they actually do influence later works like The Mist and, again, Alien. When we move from there, we encounter a lot of widely known literary geniuses, I would say. For instance, Stephen King, from Carrie to It and Pet Sematary. And I've noticed that a lot of Stephen King movies get chosen for adaptions nowadays as like movies and video games. Would you agree?
Yeah. But he also, I mean, it's not hard. The hard part from doing it from a book to a movie is getting it good. Because if you do it word by word from the movie, then it's like, oh, you might as well just read the book.
Yeah.
And like Pet Sematary, the first one,
The original.
I've seen it. It's not great. Some of the horror or makeup design is great. If you haven't seen it, spoilers, the kid dies.
Spoilers.
And like all they did was just take the child actor, make him a little bit more pale, and that was it. They're like, ooh, spooky. I mean, kids are
spooky.
Kids can be creepy anyways without it, but it's bad.
Oh, the amount of stories I've heard from parents who just want to drop kick their kids in the middle of the night because they see them down a dark hallway and they just get frightened makes me laugh. But just imagining that as somebody who has tons of nieces and nephews, that I can understand the whole scary kid thing.
Yeah.
Now, I will say Stephen King does have a ton of books out. Like, he has been, I feel like, nonstop writing since he really hit the, like, horror shelves. Would you say? You agree?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like every time I go to any kind of library or Barnes & Nobles, there's always, like, new Stephen King novels. You know what I mean? Once we move from Stephen King, we've also got Shirley Jackson, which is a psychological horror, like The Haunting of Hill House. And then we kind of shift towards more suburban and real-world horror. So the more modern horror literary like works are more, well, somebody could break in your house and murder you. Somebody has kidnapped your kid, you've got to go get them. Things like this. They're real life things that people are scared of and terrified of in their day-to-day lives. I mean, would you agree with this? That most modern works now are just realistic fears of people?
Yeah, and then you can also, like, with the fictitious side of modern horror, you got stuff like creepypastas, the backrooms, SCP, all that other stuff that you can find online that's more modern, I guess.
Oh, you can go down a deep rabbit hole with those.
Yeah, once you start, you're like, oh, what's this? Oh, Slender Man. Ooh. What are these other creepypastas? Oh, Jeff the Killer, Jane the Killer, Smile Dog, and all the different ways people interpret it and make it their own stories.
Yeah.
Just based from one little picture someone put up on a horror website not too long ago.
That is true, yeah. Okay, so now that we've gone through the literary horror works, let's move into and talk about the movies, the film side of this, okay? So, because horror really came alive when we saw it on screen, some of the earliest horror films came out of Germany in like the 1920s, like Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. They used shadows, strange sets, and haunting imagery to build a sense of dread that still holds up. But horror really hit the mainstream with the Universal monsters in the 1930s. Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Mummy. Again, these guys weren't just monsters. They were pulp culture icons, and they have paved the way for every horror villain that came after. So, starting with the silent era to the golden age monsters. So, like I said, the first ones were the German Expressionism, Nosferatu in 1922, and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920. So, recently we saw the resurfacing of the Nosferatu movie and a more modern take on it, where he was this big scary guy who was madly in love with this girl, and he just had to have her. Is essentially the whole feel of the movie, in my opinion. Would you say it's about the same for the more modern one?
Yeah, kind of.
Because you and I went and watched it almost the day it came out.
We did watch it the day it came out.
Yeah. So, what was you... Okay, we've all seen little clips of the original Nosferatu.
Yeah.
Whether it's just been clips on the internet, TikTok, or, my way, SpongeBob. Where he's flickering the lights.
Nosferatu.
So we've all kind of seen it just pop up in our daily lives. Me personally, I have not watched the original Nosferatu in its entirety. I don't think very many people have that are from like mine and your generations.
Yeah, it's one of those things, if you're really into these kind of old horror movies, you go out of your way to watch.
Yeah.
But like me, like, sure, it's interesting, but I'm not going to go out of my way to watch it.
Yeah. Yeah, true.
I'm just not that interested.
I feel like when it comes to like the silent era and the golden age monsters, when you go to watch the original ones, I feel like it's more of a like film class kind of situation, and not so much as it's Saturday morning, you know what I want to watch? Let's watch black and white silent films.
Yeah. And then also, like, on top of not being interested, it's also the availability.
That is true. I feel like the older the horror movie is, the harder it is sometimes to find when you're not able to, say, like, rent it out or something. But I also want to say that when you talk about some of the older ones, like, for instance, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I have seen, obviously we've all, like I said, seen parts of Nosferatu. Until, like, doing this research, I had never actually heard of the Cabinet Dr. Caligari. But knowing what it's about now, which, like I was telling you earlier before we started this, looking at the pictures, it reminds me a lot of, like, a Tim Burton feel, because of how they did the makeup, how they did the posters for it. It's a German silent film, and it's about how at a carnival in Germany, Francis and his friend Alan encountered the crazed Dr. Caligari, who has a somnambulist named Caesar, which is a hypnotized man, and he can see the future and predicts Alan's death, which becomes true. That, to me, doesn't really feel like it would match today's horror.
No.
That feels more like that would have fit better with, like, the Satanic Panic style horror. Does that make sense? Because this is, like, back in the 1920s where they still had the freak carnivals. where, oh, that lady has a beard. Oh, that's a little person. Oh, look at this kid who only has 2 hands. You know what I mean? So I feel like...
Yeah, I hope everyone has 2 hands.
I'm sorry, 2 fingers only. My bad. And I feel like it fit back then, but it also would fit really well in the Satanic Panic when everybody's like, oh, you like metal bands, so you must be worshiping the devil. And it seems like that would have fit better into that. And I feel like that's why it hasn't come up again like Nosferatu has. When we move away from the German Expressionism, we move into, like I was saying earlier, the monsters, which is like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman. We've all seen so many adaptions of these 4 films specifically, and they really tick back to the literary fictions we were talking about. And I feel like the last Dracula movie I remember was from like the early 2010s. When he was up in the cave with the bats. When it's just Dracula.
Yeah.
Of course, we've had all of the mummies. You and I have watched all of them. And that kind of goes through. And let me tell you, the Mummy as a kid messed me up. Like, I knew it wasn't real. But you could not have told little self me that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, when we move away from that, we now move into the Atomic Age and the 60s tension. This is where we move from the monsters into a sci-fi horror. So you've got Godzilla from 1954, The Blob, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You also have psychological horror from Psycho in 1960. And then this is where we move into the slasher and satanic panic of the 70s and 80s. By the 1970s and 80s, horror was in your face, literally. This is when we get the rise of the slasher film with masked killers like Michael Myers in Halloween, Jason in Friday the 13th, and Freddy Krueger in Nightmare on Elm Street. These movies were all about the fear that felt close to home, the idea that horror could happen in your own backyard. But at the same time, we also had supernatural horror like The Exorcist that tapped into religious fears and cultural anxieties. Horror was evolving to match what people were scared of at the time, whether it was nuclear war, the devil, or the stranger down the street. Now, during this time is also when I believe the term serial killer started to kind of pop around. Because it was really during the 80s when that term, I believe, actually got coined. So, back here in the 70s and 80s, you had, like, the serial killers and the baby snatchers and all of these things were hitting the mainstream really hard. And then you also had, what was their name? The Exorcist and the Omen. It was the couple that would go around and go to these.
Yeah, Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Yes, Ed and Lorraine Warren were also hitting this really hard. Like, they were popping up everywhere. Like, I've heard about some of their cases where, you know, it was kind of iffy on if it was real or not. And a lot of stuff has been debunked and gone through. But it was so heavy in, like, the mainstream. And, like it's, like I said, literally in your face all the time. So, funny enough to me, though, is, like, my generation was obsessed with the slasher films. And I know your generation is a little bit, but not, I don't feel like as much into the slasher films.
Well, by the time, like, with a big horror movie slashers, like Freddy, Michael Myers, and Freddy Krueger,
yeah.
By the time the 2000s rolled around, they were kind of getting old and stale.
Yeah.
Because how many times can you just remake the same movie with someone getting stabbed or strangled or beaten to death? That's when you start getting into movies more with paranormal happenings.
That is true, yeah.
But like I said, after a while, you can only make the same movie again and again before
you run out. Yeah.
That's why you get like really bad movies like Jason X or some of the later the later Nightmare on Elm Street movies where they were just like, what were you thinking?
Yeah.
What were you on? Can I have some? Clearly, this is you guys thought this was a good idea.
That's true. I feel like when it comes to like Halloween and Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, blah blah blah, I feel like linked in with these should have been also the Chainsaw Massacres. Do you feel like they would have been part of the slasher stuff?
Yeah, it is a slasher.
That's kind of what I was thinking because,
the first one came out in the 70s.
That's what I was thinking, and like I've driven past that area, and I can see how that would have gone unnoticed. And I know a lot of it is based on true facts and true things that happened. Mm-hmm. And I can see that. Like, we're in Texas. It's I think, like a 3-hour drive from us. And I've driven past there going, to the coast from where I am now. And it's literally in the middle of BFE. Like, there is nothing but that house and that gas station. And seeing that as somebody who's only seen parts of the movies, because, as you know, I grew up not being able to watch these,
Yeah.
And now, coming into, like, my later 20s and now early 30s, I'm trying to catch up on at these things, So now seeing these pieces of all of this, I could see how these people would have been terrified. You know what I mean? Now, when it comes to The Exorcist, The Omen, what is your opinion on the more paranormal style movies?
To go back to what I said about slasher films, like I said, like with any movie, kind of really, you can only do the same thing before it gets old.
Yeah.
Now, how you do it, of course, that's what makes it interesting. Like the Paranormal Activity movies.
That was the one where it showed from the video cameras, right?
Yeah, it's found footage movies.
I have not watched any of those.
I've seen the first one, and that's it.
Okay.
But I've seen reviews for all the other movies.
Uh-huh.
And, like, it starts out, a demon haunting the family in the first movie, but then it's like it slides down into it's a cult doing it. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to use this demon to get wealthy and power. Yeah, it's a lot. Or like what's the other one? I can't remember what it's called. Not Midsommar. I can't remember what it's called. But it's also kind of the same concept. This cult is trying to use this demon to get power, and it's in the wrong body, so they kill off the little girl that it's possessing, so they can move it into her older brother's body, because that's the kind of body that demon wants.
Okay.
If I remember what it's called, I'll say it, but I don't remember what it is at the moment.
Okay. So my thing when it comes to like the paranormal style films, I think those are the ones that really mess with me the worst. And I think it's because of the fact that those are things like that are unknown. Everybody has their own opinions on whether ghosts and the paranormal are real and all this stuff. And it can be trapped into more religious fears, like I was saying earlier, or just cultural beliefs, And what movie was it that you made fun of me for? Was it the Ouija?
Yeah, Ouija.
Yeah. So we were watching that, and I get super into movies when I watch them. Like, my brain is like, oh, this is real. This right here, you're watching on a screen, but it's real. Okay? So when I'm watching things...
Hereditary. The movie's called Hereditary.
Oh, the one
yeah, the one I was saying.
I got real confused. But when we were watching it, I got so into it where I get tunnel vision in these movies. And it's not really that it scares me. It's more of all of a sudden something really quick happens. Jump horrors and jump scares are what gets me really quickly. And in Ouija, or Ouija, however you want to say it. Some people say Ouija.
Well, they're wrong.
When you watch that movie, it feels like a very corny paranormal movie. Like, they kind of harp on the same things that a lot of, like, the older paranormal movies harp on. Where there's not really a difference between that and maybe something you might have watched, like, 10 years ago. You know what I mean? But the newer ones, I think, are getting better at not the shock value, but the, like, quick movements all of a sudden. You know what I mean? So, moving from the 1970s, we then move into the body horrors, like The Thing and the Videodrome. I don't actually know anything about these two movies. Have you seen anything on them?
Yeah.
So what do you think about the body horrors?
Personally, I don't like body horror. It just makes my skin crawl.
Okay.
Like seeing like something you recognize twisted into this grotesque form of what it used to be.
Yeah.
Like The Thing, like in one of the scenes in the original The Thing movie, one of the characters is infected by this alien cells, I think.
Yeah.
And his head detaches from his torso, and the way it stretches, it looks. When you really look at it, it doesn't look great because it's a movie from the 80s. But like the first time seeing it, like all this green stretch out of where his neck used to attach to his torso, was gross. And then watching his head just walk around the 4 little legs that just sprouted out the bottom.
Ew.
Yeah, it's creepy looking.
Yeah, I mean, body horrors, I wouldn't really say, like I said, I've never seen The Thing or Videodrome. But body horrors in general, I feel like creeps so many people out because of the fact that it's something that you can see and your brain kind of goes, no. Like, I don't know how to explain it better than that. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with the DARE program in school. Yeah. And I said that the one thing that kind of clicked with me and why my brain said I am never doing crack a day in my life was them talking about and showing that people would pick at their skin because of the fact that they thought there were bugs there. And just thinking about that feeling creeps me out so bad. So I feel like for people who have problems with like that, or people touching their eyes, or, you know, seeing people get cut open, like I feel like that's where the body horror really comes into like a more, like, it has more oomph with those. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So moving out of the 70s, 80s, and 60s, we're going to look at the meta and international horrors of the 90s and 2000s. So with the meta horror, you've got Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. With the J horror, you've got Ringu, Ju-on, and their American remakes. And then you've got torture horror of Saw and Hostel. Now, you and I just watched one of the more recent Screams within the last few months.
Yeah, the one with Jenna Ortega.
Yeah, and that was really the only reason I wanted to watch it. That is the only Scream I've seen all the way through, but I know like the premises of them. I've seen a lot of different parts of each one. And to me, they don't seem very scary. It's again, like you were saying earlier, there's only so many times you can repeat something where it's going to be entertaining. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, I Know What You Did Last Summer, as a kid, messed me up. That was one of the only horror movies we really had in the house. And I think it was because of my older sister having it. And that movie and the I Still Know What You Did Last Summer both got me started in the horror movies. That and I don't remember what it's called, but it was a horror movie about a demonic baby. Because the lady got pregnant, she tried to take a online supplement that would get this baby out of her system, and it ended up causing a baby who'd killed people. It was so stupid, but it scared the living Jesus out of me when I was little. When you move into things like the torture horror and the torture porn, you really look into like things like Saw, that is, to me, terrifying. Would you agree?
Yeah. Like if you got hooked up to one of these traps where you have to mutilate your own body to save yourself, it's kind of messed up.
Yeah.
Like I've seen a few of the Saw movies, and that's gross.
It really is. And I mean, I know that the Human Centipede, it comes out slightly after this. I stupidly watched the first Human Centipede when I was going on my very first like horror binge watching like year, where I was on Netflix just trying to find every horror movie that I could ingest.
Yeah.
And the Human Centipede happened to fall into one of those, and it messed me up so bad. I think I had nightmares for like a week. And then looking at the second one, which I believe these would technically fall under the torture horror. Would you agree? Because they do kind of torture them. You know, cutting them open and sewing them together.
I guess it would fall under torture. I've never seen it. I refuse to see those movies. I know the concept of it. I just don't want to look at it.
That's very fair. The first one I will say is a lot easier to watch than the second one. I got 10 minutes into that second one and I quit and I refused to go back to it. But the second one does take on a black and white look to it, whereas the first one is full color. So the second one is a little bit more, this is gritty, you know?
Yeah, well, that's the thing with like 2000s movies. It's when they also started doing a lot of remakes.
That's true.
And everything either had the blue filter or the brown filter.
Yeah, that's very true. Moving away from that, you then enter into the modern horror, which is the 2010s to now. So now we've got what's called elevated horror, like Get Out, Hereditary, and The Witch. Then you've got the indie boom, which is It Follows, and The Babadook, a personal favorite of mine, and horror as social and psychological commentary. Now, looking at the elevated horror, did you see Get Out?
No.
Okay. My sister and I watched that on Halloween night because we were saving it for that, right?
Yeah.
And we watched it, and we were both, I would say, probably flabbergasted when we got done with it. It is such a well-made movie because you're watching it the whole time, and unless you've seen like parts of it before that, we had not seen anything besides the trailer. We did not realize what the heck was going to happen watching that whole thing. And I usually can pick up, kind of figure out what's probably going to happen. That was such a well-made movie that we were very surprised. And then Hereditary comes back up where you were talking about it.
Yeah.
With the indie boom, I'm going to kind of touch on the Babadook. You haven't seen that one yet, have you?
No.
Okay. So the Babadook actually is, I believe, a B-rated film. It doesn't really have anybody of like huge Hollywood standing, quote unquote. It is a child's book, kind of scary, where the first time you watch it, if you're really into it or it's dark, you're gonna get a little scared, I guess. But when you rewatch it and you see what's actually happening, it's almost like a horror film told from a child's perspective, like what a child would find scary.
Yeah.
And it's honestly a very interesting movie to watch. Now, horror is social and psychological commentary. This is such a wide berth of what you could see as horror, and I feel like this goes into more of like the serial killer stuff. Like, for instance, like the documentary, quote-unquote, films where it kind of goes into, this survivor's tale of it being in and then escaping the serial killer's clutches, I guess.
Yeah.
Would you kind of agree that that's kind of what would fall into the social and psychological stuff?
I'm not sure. Because with like psychological stuff, I think that's more like, yeah, you could have like a little bit of physical harm in there, but a lot of it's just like all mental stuff.
Yeah. Like, what is it? Split?
Split.
Would you count that one as a quote-unquote psychological horror?
Yeah, because like he doesn't really, I mean, yeah, he like chloroforms the character.
Yeah. But
he doesn't really, like, from what I've seen, really like physically harm her.
Mm-mm.
He just kind of holds her hostage and just messes with her the whole time.
Fucks with her the whole fucking time.
Yeah, so I'd say that's psychological.
Okay.
Or like literally like anything that where the main character isn't really physically gets harmed.
Would you think that the horror movies where, I cannot remember what it's called, but the lady is deaf, the whole movie has no sound. Mm-hmm. But you can see it from her perspective as she can see that this robber is coming in, and it's terrifying her. Like, I don't think she ever really gets hurt. But would you count that as a more psychological thing? Or would you compare that to more of like the elevated horror?
Elevated horror.
Would you? Okay. So, now, the horror made the leap into video games as early as the 80s and 90s. And this was a game changer, literally. Early attempts like Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark set the stage, but it wasn't until Resident Evil hit in 1996 that survival horror really took off. Zombies, limited ammo, and dark hallways. What more could you want? And then came Silent Hill, which added psychological layers and disturbing symbolism. You weren't just fighting monsters, you were confronting your character's inner demons. And it was horror with depth, and it stuck with you long after you turned off the console. So, like you were saying earlier, the video games was kind of your intro into the horror genre. So, I know you've played Resident Evil, like many of them. Would you say that they really are more horror related, or would you say they're just a dark survival?
So when you first start with like the first Resident Evil game, when you're in Spencer's Mansion, I'd say survival horror. It's not really like a horror game where you can fight back. You can fight the monsters back. Compared to like other kind of horror where it's like, oh, I can't fight back. I have to run, and hiding is my only option. But like later in the series with Resident Evil, it kind of goes off the rails and becomes more action focused.
Yeah.
Like with it starts with Resident Evil 5, where you're going around roundhouse kicking the zombies.
Okay.
And Leon makes all these silly ass quips.
Gotcha.
Resident Evil 6 is really when it's off the rails, like you're flying a helicopter that's going down, and you crash into like a bazillion things, and you're like, how are these people not dead?
Yeah.
Or just all the explosion. It looks like a Michael Bay action movie.
Yeah.
Just all these things going off all at the same time, and it's like, it's like, oh, it's Resident Evil. You know, there's the zombies, there's the mutants and all that stuff, but like it's not really traditional. It's not even really horror anymore.
Yeah, I can see that. Now, have you played either of the other ones that I'd said, like Sweet Home, Alone in the Dark, or Silent Hill? Have you played any of those?
I'd like to play some of the Silent Hill games. I know what they're about, some of them, but like the older games, it comes down just to accessibility.
That's true, because I know
unless they're like on like Steam or something, you're gonna have to go to a website and then download it, or
and hope it's not a sketch,
or you're gonna have to buy an old console, which can be expensive, and you got to buy the TV for it, and then you got to hunt down a copy. And it can get really expensive really quick.
That is true. Now, the first Silent Hill did come out in 1999, which I thought it would have come out, I guess, a little bit older than that. Because I remember watching one of the Silent Hill movies and seeing that I could see why it was made into video games. Like, seeing that made me want to kind of explore that Silent Hill world more and just to see what's actually there. Because I know Silent Hill has shaped a lot of people and their love for horror in different ways. You always see it like Comic-Cons and stuff. You always see the people who are dressed as the Silent Hill characters.
Yeah, like Pyramid Head. Because Pyramid Head is the most iconic Silent Hill antagonist right next to the Bubblehead nurses. Yeah,
I see the Bubblehead nurses a lot, but I think that's just because it's an easier cosplay to make. But the Pyramid Head has so many adaptations that people have made, so I can see why that one would be like one of the foundational like hits for horror, both films and video games, you know what I mean? Now, when we move into the 2000s to the 2010s, you move into more of like the atmospheric horror, so Fatal Frame, Dead Space, Amnesia. Then you have the rise of the indie horror like Outlast, Five Nights at Freddy's, Layers of Fear. Now, when I first started playing horror games, I started playing with Doom 90, I think it was Doom 95. The same one you were playing the other day where it's like, oh, hey, I know that. So, that's where I got started in horror. A lot of people don't think that's a horror game. I find it to be because of the fact that it does have so many, like, pop tears. So they kind of just pop up and they scream, or it's, like, real loud all of a sudden. Things like that. To me, when you start putting that into more video games, I feel like that can turn a game that's not supposed to be quote-unquote horror into where it could fit into the horror genre. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Like with some, where the main focus is more action in a horror game. Well, not horror games. There'd be more action games with horror elements thrown in there. Like you said with Doom, where you'll just be minding your business, then just boom, they're all of a sudden there.
Yeah.
And you don't expect it, but they get you, so you jump a little. Or with Doom, like ties back to with the Satanic Panic.
Yeah.
Because all the satanic imagery, you got all the pentagrams.
Oh, yeah.
You're fighting the demons, and so your very religious grandma's like, you shouldn't be playing that. And you're like, but grandma, I'm fighting the demons. She still probably won't get it. But
Crusades,
I guess. But like with Doom and listening to heavy metal music and all that other jazz.
Yeah. It's easy to kind of slip into it.
Yeah.
Now, you've played Five Nights at Freddy's, haven't you?
Yes.
And you've played Outlast.
Yes.
Have you played any of the Fatal Frame, Dead Space, or Amnesia games?
I've played the Dead Space remake.
Okay.
I've played a bit of the second one. 3 kind of leans more into the action horror stuff.
Yeah.
But it still has its elements of horror with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've played Amnesia. I've played a couple indie horror games, but they don't really stick out to me, I guess.
That's true.
And then with like Five Nights at Freddy's, it starts off horror, and of course, you're stuck in a chair. You got 2 doors and cameras, and that's all you get.
Yeah.
But once you start getting down to the later games where the story goes off the rails, and it gets kind of really silly.
Yeah.
Because like with Security Breach, yeah, it's open world, but you're in a brightly lit complex, and you can you could see the animatronics moving around, and they're brightly colored.
Yeah.
And they say catchphrases, and it's
gets real silly.
It's silly, yeah, and it's mascot horror. Five Nights at Freddy's, so stuff like Poppy's Playtime, or I think it's called Garten of Bam Bam. I've never played it, or
I've heard of the Poppies, yeah.
But like it's mascot horror, and it's something more the kids are into.
When you talk mascot horror, would you think that Bendy and the Ink Machine would fall under that?
Yes, it's mascot horror.
That's what I was thinking.
Because when you think of, like, if I told you Bendy and the Ink Machine, what do you think of?
Honestly, one
of the characters.
Yeah, I think of the little Mickey Mouse looking dude.
Yeah, or like if someone who knows about the Five Nights at Freddy's series, and I walk up to them and be like, hey, when I tell you Five Nights at Freddy's, what do you think of? They're going to tell you about the animatronics.
That's true.
Poppy's Playtime, the big stupid blue whatever the hell that thing is. I've never played it. It looks ridiculous.
I've seen a lot of clips of it, but never really done it. Things though like Outlast, where you have to use
all you have is your camcorder.
The camcorder, and you don't have anything else. Those terrify me. Yeah. You've seen me try to play that multiple times. Like, I want to. I can watch people play them all day, all night, have no problem. But as soon as I get into these games, I shut down. You've seen me do this many times. Because, what was it that you bought me? It was one of the... not Resident Evil.
Yeah, Resident Evil 7.
That's what it was.
Yeah, Resident Evil 7... And then afterwards, that's when it goes back to the horror aspect and not off-the-rails action.
I feel like when it's games where it's really, really gritty and more dark-toned, I feel like those games are more horror than things like Five Nights at Freddy's and things like that. Like Amnesia, for instance. Amnesia has a ton of different ones. The one that I played was the one where you're down in the bunkers.
Yeah, it's called Amnesia the Bunker.
That's what I thought. It has that real dark grittiness to it, and it's honestly very terrifying to me. Just not really being able to see what you need to see. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, the more recent trends of video games and horror come into the narrative and cinematic horror like Until Dawn and The Quarry, and then you go into the VR horror experiences like The Last of Us and Alan Wake 2. Now, with these, I do want to touch upon the fact of actual survival games that are horror, like The Forest and The Sons of the Forest, which to me is not as scary as the first one. And then you've got also things where it's not really monsters that can scare you, it's just life in general, like The Long Dark. It does have, when you first play it, you don't really know what's happening. It does have a bit of a horror feel to it because of the fact that you never know when these, maybe like the wolves or the bears, will just pop out and attack you. You don't know what's going to happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
when we talk about horror in video games, what horror style video game stuck out to you the most? In all of your years of playing video games, what would you say it was?
Well, it stuck out to me the most?
Yeah.
I don't play a lot of horror games, so it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
I'd say the Resident Evil 2 remake.
Okay. Why would you say that one?
Because like I said, I've had like the passing, or like not passing interest. I like the Resident Evil series. I like all the lore and all the stuff to it. But like bringing back the game from '98, where everyone was all cubes and triangles, very very low poly count.
Yeah.
And then bringing it into the modern day, where it's like you can see the detail, like the horror on your character's face.
Yeah.
Or whenever Mr. X is chasing you, he doesn't. You just hear his thumps as he follows you.
Yeah.
He doesn't say. He doesn't yell. He doesn't scream. He doesn't do anything. He just follows you. And when he gets close, tries to beat you to death.
Yeah.
And then then seeing like some of the creatures that they have in their in more realistic ways, like the lickers. How they're literally just exposed muscle claws in a brain. Like, that's creepy to look at. Like, if you saw one of those real life, you're going to be, like, puking on the floor how gross that thing looks.
That is true.
Or just, like, the weird plant. They're not zombies. They're, like, weird plant creatures.
Gotcha.
But I'd say that sticks out to me the most.
That's fair. I'm going to have to stick with mine being legitimately the Forest. Like, I have played that. I have so many hours in the Forest. I will go back to it countless times again and again and again. My thing is, like, a lot of people don't understand that game adapts with you the longer you stay alive in the game. And a lot of people don't realize that because they're like, let's just get this game done. Let's finish out the story. Let's get it. And people don't realize that the longer you play in it, the worse the mutations get. And going down into those tunnels and the caves, to me, is absolutely terrifying. Because, again, tight spaces, it's dark and gritty. You really don't have a lot of light, so you can't see. And I think that, for me, is my biggest thing with horror. So, from ghostly novels to slashers and immersive video games, horror has been constantly re-innovating itself. It's a mirror of what society fears and what we can't look away from. So, a little bit of research that I was looking at shows that the enjoyment of horror content comes from an anxiety comprehension. You are so anxious in real life that horror content is comforting for you because once it's over, your brain compares that crazy high-intensity incident to your real life. And in comparison, your real life isn't that scary. So, all you horror fanatics out there, kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So, with that being said, why don't you share your favorite horror story, game, or movie with us?
Thanks for wandering through history with us on Echoes of the Past.
If you liked what you heard, subscribe, rate us, and tell that one friend who still quotes fun facts at parties.
And remember, history may repeat itself,
but we promise not to.
See you
in the next Echo.